Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. So, yeah, I'm Hamza. I'm actually from Lahore, and I moved here, and I'm currently in my second semester to do a master's at University of Lugano in Switzerland. And I'm specializing in philosophy of mind. This paper that I wrote in my undergrad, and it was something that I was very interested in at the time. And one of the things that I want to kind of draw everybody's attention to before I actually begin is, firstly, in the abstract provided in the booklet, one thing that's important is that I will attempt to prove that the moderate epistemic particularism, MEP conception, that Cassam proposes as an alternative to the rational agent model and the radicalization model is more or less the same thing as RAM. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is the last bit where I talk about, on a second and deeper analysis, the question is, does this also mean that governments which have chosen to carry out certain actions, such as invasions in foreign nations, as a result of which certain terrorist groups have arisen due to the prevailing tumultuous circumstances, would have to recognize their part in the formation of the terrorist and incarnate themselves, while also understanding where the terrorist comes from or what the subjectivity of the terrorist is. So, with that said, firstly, what is the radicalization model, or the RAD? So, some of these are just like quotations, just to have everybody on the same page. So, according to the radicalization model, people turn to political violence because they have been radicalized. Professor Cassam does draw that sometimes it's talked about with regards to Islam-related terrorism, not so much about Irish terrorism in the late 20th century. Nonetheless, we can see why it's more attractive to governments because even though it is not, maybe we want to, yeah, sorry. This does not count for my time, just saying.
You can continue talking, I guess.
Okay. So, nevertheless, it is easy to see why RAD is more attractive to governments because even though, that doesn't imply that terrorism might be justifiable and it has policy implications that governments find congenial. For example, governments will be finding it easier to predict political violence, and you can also then, if people are radicalized, then people who aren't yet radicalized can also be prevented from becoming radicalized. Second slide would then be the rational agent model. So the rational agent model is the one that that says that terrorism is the work of rational agents employing violent means to pursue political objectives. It can be a collectively rational strategic choice, or it can have logical processes that can be discovered and explained. Then we have the third account, which is the moderate epistemic particularism, or MEP. In this account, there are multiple idiosyncratic pathways to cognitive and behavioral radicalization, and the actions and motivations of terrorists can only be understood rather than explained by engaging with their subjectivity in a way that depends on a degree of empathy. And, sorry. Then we come to the keyword, empathy. Can we have empathy with terrorists? That was one question that was also addressed before, but many people would not be happy to say so or do so, and governments definitely would not be happy to do so. Several reasons would be that it is impossible to engage with the subjectivity of people like Muhammad Siddiq Khan, the conviction that their words offer little genuine insight into their deeds, which is also something we spoke about, or the worry that accepting that terrorists are rational agents comes very close to accepting that their murderous acts might, at least in principle, be justifiable. So why feel the need for the MEP? Well, that was because of the shortcomings of the rational agent model and the radicalization model. Some of these have their source in the failure of RAD and RAM to grasp a metaphysical point. Terrorists, like people generally, are complex particulars that interact continuously with a variety of uncontrollable environmental factors. Another important element of the MEP is that it works backwards, that's my emphasis, from effects to causes. And instead of positing generic psychological mechanisms to explain why some people carry out acts of terrorism, it stresses the extent to which pathways to terrorism tend to be highly individual, idiosyncratic, and contingent. As far as the MEP is concerned, there is no general answer to the question, what leads a person to political violence? So that is the setup that we have for now from the paper. So my main beginning point is that RAM, as far as I understood it from Professor Cassam's paper, does not necessarily entail general laws. All it asks is that terrorists do have logical processes which can be understood and explained, and that can only be done if we are to look at logical processes of the terrorists with taking into account the fact that terrorists do behave like complex particulars. That is, the terrorist is someone who responds to factors outside of their control. My contention is that when we do look at someone rationally, empathy is a given in that regard. You cannot truly distance yourself emotionally from a terrorist's reasoning if you are looking at it from a rational standpoint. But if you look at it from the radicalization model, you do have more detachment there than you do with the rational agent model or the MEP. Another element that I wanted to get into, the question that I asked. So in the paper, it says, as has often been observed, terrorism is the weapon of the weak and employed by them as the most effective, or in some cases only realistic means of achieving their political goals in adverse conditions. When dealing with repressive regimes or dictatorships, terrorism may be the only means of bringing about change, given that the ballot box has been ruled out. I slightly disagree. Not necessarily. Terrorism can and often is the acts of those who are in power. Now, I don't want to get controversial here, but I do think certain countries, United States of America included, do walk the thin line between terrorism and what could be called just war. But anyway, the US at that time I wrote as one example. But if anything, if terrorism is the act of the weak, then in many ways, especially if it is a response to acts of continued violence, we also might need to zero in on it as a means of violent protest or rebellion rather than as terrorism. This, of course, becomes relevant in terms of Hamas and Gaza and Israel. And we saw with October 7, we heard from Judith Butler saying that it might be, in fact, thought of as an armed rebellion against continued occupation. Now, the thing is that when that particular event happened, when the events of October 7 happened, it is very hard to say that it's the act of the weak, because I do not think at that particular time the individuals who were carrying out the acts of terrorism were in fact weak. And I think that a terrorist at the time of their act of terrorism is in fact the one in power. And of course, whenever there is an act of terrorism, there are victims of terrorism. So who are these victims? These are the ones who have been subjected to terrorism, meaning that the terrorists had the power to harm them and make them into their victims. Now, I want to apply the rational agent model or try to be ramistic about bin Laden. So as per Cassam and English also quoted in the paper, and Nagel also quoted in the paper, the shortcomings of RAM are that the idea that the 9/11 attacks would have such a result could have only been seriously entertained by those with a shaky grasp of political reality. And bin Laden's view that the 9/11 attacks would be an effective means of attaining his strategic objectives can only be described as delusional. But I wanted to probe that a bit further. In my paper, I made the case that bin Laden's attempts to harm US interests were actually not only successful, but quite cunning. Margolis asserted that bin Laden's strategy was to draw the Americans into a series of small but expensive wars that would ultimately bankrupt them. Chomsky also quotes that a report from the Costs of War project at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs estimates that the final bill will be $3.2 to $4 trillion. Quite an impressive achievement by bin Laden. So I don't think he's irrational to the point of being delusional. I think an element of treating one as a rational agent also means understanding how ridiculously, seemingly delusional their arguments might be. It's not that they are incapable of using reason. They are capable, but how effectively they use that tool of reason is very different from whether they do so. I do think they use reason, I just think they do it ineffectively. I think I should mention here that bin Laden, when his compound was in Abbottabad, when he was murdered or killed or executed, whatever word, he had books of Chomsky's in his bookshelf So it's kind of interesting that, again, I don't want it to be thought of that he's not a rational agent. I think you can use the RAM model and apply it quite effectively to bin Laden. Yeah. So the RAM and MEP debate. Cassam writes, Professor Cassam, sorry, writes of RAM as something that does not take it as a given that terrorists have irrational or incoherent objectives, and many clearly do not. Now, what is the MEP then? It too takes it as a given that terrorists have rational objectives. The only apparent difference that was highlighted is that the MEP is somehow more complex because it looks into particulars. It recognizes that one event for terrorist A may not have the same effect for terrorist B, and that radicalization does not have a single unitary model. But again, where does it say that RAM does not do these things as well? After all, if we are considering someone rationally, we will think, quite obviously, that an event can hold different meanings and effects for different people, and we would also understand that radicalization can manifest itself in many forms. Rationally, one would think bin Laden did what he did for different reasons. What Hafiz Saeed does is for different reasons. My worry about the MEP. I want to return to something I mentioned earlier about how the MEP moves from understanding terrorist actions from effects to causes. There is one major problem here that's relevant on a metaphysical level as well as on a governmental level when governments are developing policies against terrorism. Necessarily, MEP demands that we wait for a terrorist to commit an act of terrorism in order to understand it. Now, for example, now this is from my paper. You look at 9/11 and you understand the terrorist motives and you ensure that they are listened to and something terrible akin to that does not arise according to the MEP model. But then in 2021, let's say, well, again, I wrote this in 2019, let's say a biological attack occurs of a nature completely unprecedented before, with demands being made by terrorists or motivations being spouted by them, completely different from what has ever been said by a terrorist hitherto. Then, according to Professor Kassam's MEP perspective, we would have to try to understand what the terrorist motivations were, move from effects to causes. But these effects have been disastrous. Millions lie dead, buildings have been blown up, economy of the targeted region is in tatters. Surely we would not want this to happen to be able to understand what it was that drove a terrorist to act in such a manner. If anything, governments are in the business of preventing atrocities, not in the business of understanding them after they've occurred. What we need is the ability to be able to predict chaos before it occurs so as to subvert it. Now, it sounds a bit far-fetched, okay, are we actually going to have an event that has no historical precedent? I think climate protests becoming terroristic is something that's happening now, which I don't think people could have predicted some time ago. The Unabomber is one example of that. And now I'm kind of worried that in the future, and we just heard about the post office scandal. Who could have ever thought that the post office would be acting in the way that it did? And similarly, I worry now that there's probably going to be some sort of terrorism against AI even, from people who are worried that it's going to take over the world. I don't know how that's going to work out, but let's see. Now, a new model, I'm in my last minute, is understanding why bin Laden, so understanding why bin Laden did 9/11 won't help us avoid a future attack if its context, reasoning, manifestation are different from the dynamics of 9/11. For that, the MEP becomes useless, and we would need some other model, but not necessarily RAM or RAD. The feature of this new model, I think it's very important that it needs to have two things. One, that it needs the ability to make general laws that allow predictions, and two, that it considers a ratio empathetic approach to terrorists that is grounded in historical and cultural realities, with also a consideration for socioeconomic constraints and backgrounds. I use the word ratio empathetic because, again, like I said, I think empathy and rationality are both things that are tied together. And then the reason, I think we can all understand why we need a historical and cultural reality grounding, but then we also need an understanding of the socioeconomic background and constraints, which is, again, what I was thinking about with regards to the video that we watched today. I do think that this boy, at the end of the day, weirdly enough, it sounded like he was just trying to say, hey, Dad, I've done it. I've achieved something great that you always wanted me to do. And that was just, I felt bad for this boy, but I could understand at least what he was trying. It was just sad, but, so I do think that kind of family setup or that kind of culture where your father's sort of appeasement is something that you're really looking forward to, all of these things also need to be taken into account. And with that, I'm done, and I have 5 minutes left. Thank you. So, yeah.